Marvel Snap's newest patch has a nerf to the best deck in the game and a buff to one of my personal favorite cards for players leaving Series 2. The nerf to one of the best cards in the game at issue here is, of course, Angela, going from a 2-0 that gets +2 when a card is played on her lane to a 2-3 that gets +1. Now, there are multiple issues to address here, so I'm going to start with perhaps the most salient. This is a fairly significant nerf. Angela is, in my opinion, the absolute best card in almost all of the decks that she's in. Many people will point to Ravonna or Athena or Nocturne as the actual things that are elite in those decks, but Angela is a card that has been consistently at the top of the metagame from the beta until literally right now, except for the other time it got nerfed to a form similar to this. During that time, Angela was a 2-2 that got +1 and was roundly regarded as pretty unplayable. During the later part of that period was when Werewolf by Night really started dominating, and then with the nerf to that, we saw so many lack of early scalers, so much of a lack of early scalers really allowed decks like Thanos to start thriving, which was not perhaps ideal for the metagame, and so they brought back Angela. I think that experiment has been, mildly successful. She hasn't been as overwhelmingly busted as you might expect, but she has been pretty consistently the absolute best card in the entire format, or in the best deck in the entire format. And I don't think it's fair to say this is ignoring the problem of, say, Ravonna or Athena or whatever you think the actual problem is, because Angela provides those cards such an easy to use home. One of the things that really sticks out to me right now about playing decks with Annihilus and Sentry and Cersei is that they really feel the lack of the Angela early game when you are playing them. You simply cannot keep up with the early game output of a deck that has access to both Angela and Athena. Now, moving on to the second most salient thing to talk about with regards to this change to Angela is she still going to be good? At 2-2, she decidedly was not, but we are in a situation where so many good cards go with her that she might end up being totally fine and totally worth trying anyway. For example, Athena ends up wanting to be in Angela decks almost by design because of how Kitty Pryde allows you to almost always have that second card. Once you've accepted that you're going to be a Kitty Pryde deck in order to play Athena, it's not a huge jump to get to, oh, I'm playing Angela as well, oh, I'm playing Nocturne as well, oh, I'm playing Jeff as well. These are all really good cards. They go amazingly with Angela. They're very cheap. I'm very often getting multiple things, so I can proc the Athena. It's a very straightforward deck building process that Angela's general ubiquity made much easier to access. Now that that general ubiquity is not there, and specifically the overlap with Ravonna is not there, I am interested to see if this ends up being a dominant core still, albeit at a lower level. I think there are a couple ways this could go. One is that the Ravonna deck changes absolutely nothing. Angela already cost 2, and making her cost 1 was very rarely an incredibly impactful thing. Getting her out alongside a 2-drop was occasionally important when triggering Athena, but it wasn't the most important thing in the deck by any means. That is one direction I think this could go. Another direction I think this could go is she could prove to be inefficient in the Ravonna shell, and then that provides us 2 more branching paths. Branching path from there is there another shell that we're going to want to be trying Athena Angela stuff in? And then the other branching path is, what if we're actually just cutting Ravonna from that? And so they sort of arrive at the same spot, which is, are we going to still be playing Angela Athena stuff? I expect the answer to be yes. If we are not going to be playing them, I genuinely wonder how that impacts the playability of a card like Athena. Because Athena, in my mind, is so tied to Kitty Pryde, and Kitty Pryde is so tied to Angela, and so much of Athena deck building is using her as an additional Angela in Angela decks, and now she's going to have to carry the load of being, if you'll pardon the turn of phrase, the primary Angela. I think that actually puts a little bit of interesting things into perspective here, which is, I think to me, and I expect people to argue with me about this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, Angela's a better card than Athena. I am fairly certain that Angela is the alpha of this group, and Athena is the beta. But this patch inverts that. Suddenly, Angela is being played because Thena wants Kitty Pryde to be in the deck, and then Angela comes along for the ride. And I'm really interested to see what that deck building inversion does to the card and does to the metagame. I worry that it might not even be enough, that you could probably just play the same 12 cards that we've been playing, and Angela being a 2-3, it's like, okay, so instead of being a 2-8, she's going to be like a 2-7 or whatever, and that's just fine. We're going to live with that, and that's like a good enough thing, and we're happy to deal with it, and it's not like the biggest hit in the world, and we're still going to be playing her, and we're still going to be doing everything we were already doing. Entirely possible. If I had to guess, I would say that is the likely outcome. However, I am interested in what it looks like when Thena has to be the one carrying the load, as opposed to Angela, who is now more of a supporting player who goes with this package of cards rather than the reason that you are playing the package of cards. Hercules being moved down to 3-4 is actually fascinating to me because it demonstrates the willingness of the developers of Marvel Snap to just throw their hands up and be like, all right, our bad. This is what you want the card to be. Here's what we're going to let you do with this card. The reason I'm so surprised by this is there are multiple comments on record from Snap devs saying that Hercules was a card that they were explicitly trying to make work as a big move card. They wanted it to be a card that was good in move decks at a 4 cost or higher. It seems that they have arrived at the conclusion that this is just not really worth trying to do, and that if you have a card that people want to play, you should put it at a cost that allows them to actually play it. Hercules getting moved down the curve is actually very impactful. The way move works, at least, currently, God forbid, I looked at the data mines, I saw Madam Web. I don't think move's going to work the same after that card drops. But the way that move works currently, it's very constrained on what I'd like to describe as turn economy. You need these setups and payoffs and things to happen. And Hercules costing 4, meaning you don't get to do any of your move stuff on 4, was actually a very meaningful downside. Moving him down to 3 makes him fit into the curve a little bit more easily. And I think a little bit even more important than that is he allows you to do this sort of awkward dance where one of the things that happens with move is you just don't really get enough stuff in the early turns of the game. But if you had the ability to double your stuff in the middle turns of the game, you'd be able to bank that. So what Hercules does to me is take the move deck and give it a way to sort of limp into these games that would otherwise be absolute losses. Like if you don't draw your dagger and an enabler, or your vulture and an enabler, or your human torch or whatever before turn 3, that is usually an issue because you're very often like, okay, I need to do this and then pick it up with Beast and then redo it again, etc., etc. Now, though, you just put the Hercules out there, you do that stuff on turn 4, and suddenly you're getting extra value out of it because of the card Hercules. I think this is a meaningful buff to move decks. I don't know if it changes their general viability. When I think of what a viable move deck looks like, quote unquote, I'm thinking of like Taskmaster type beast move builds. Those are the ones that are by far the scariest to me, and really the only ones that see play at the top end of the ladder in as much as any move deck does, which is to say, rarely, but when they do, it's this kind of build. And I do think that there are very big upsides for Hercules in this context, meaning that this is a card that allows you to limp into these games. You get the roll right on him, and suddenly your dagger is back in the lane that you had your Iron Fist in, and you're just absolutely popping off. You beast it, you do it again, you Taskmaster. It's disgusting, right? Like, that's the thing that I'm looking at specifically is Hercules, Iron Fist, Dagger, Beast, Iron Fist, and Dagger. Play Iron Fist, Dagger again. Play Taskmaster again. But here's the hidden downside. Hercules moves randomly, and your opponent can move stuff into the location in order to prevent that from happening. So let's talk about both of those potential downsides. Downside number 1 is, what if Hercules doesn't put the stuff where you need it? That's kind of an issue because you have to put your Taskmaster down and say it's going to be somewhere. So the safe thing is to put it in the Hercules lane, right? But if your opponent has a Jeff or a Nocturne, their move resolves before your on reveals happen. So your on reveals don't actually do anything sending it into the Hercules lane. I think that generally the thing that bothers me about move and how it tends to play out is all of this 50-50 guessing on the final turn of the game. It's something I don't particularly enjoy. It's not a dynamic I'm a big fan of. However, I do think that Hercules adds an element of the 50-50 where it is sort of reflected back onto the move player, which is to say, a lot of the time, when you're 50-50 guessing against move, you're guessing where they put stuff and they have full control over that. Hercules removes some of that full control, and the way that he is able to be counterplayed by your cards that move, in addition to things like that, is actually, I think, pretty meaningful to me. I'll be interested to see how this card develops into the metagame. However, if move ever does become a serious problem, Kingpin could do some real damage. A 1-2 now, all the way down from a 3-4 that blew stuff up when it moved to places in the beta, to a 2-3 that afflicted them with 2 power, and now a 1-2 that afflicts things that move into his taxable radius with -2 power. This is a potent move counterplay card. I'm fairly convinced of that. But what I'm actually wondering is there some sort of move my opponent's stuff type deck out there? A Polaris and Stegron type deck that is going to be able to access this and make it like a 1-5, a 1-7, something of that nature. I think 1-7 is where I start getting really interested in this card. A conditional 1-5 is like, fine, it's above rate, but the conditional part looms pretty large in that. A conditional 1-7 is like, we're talking like, that's what we're talking. We talk about a conditional 1-7, like that's the range I think of like Nebula in. Granted, it's like a 1-6. I for some reason was doing math with odds instead of evens because I was doing it with a 2-3 anyway. But like, it's something. I think if you get 2 procs of Kingpin, we're really talking here. Like, this is something that's like legitimately probably good if you get 2 procs of it. Issues, of course, it is a 1 cost, so it's easy to get into your curve, but it's the kind of 1 cost you want on the board before you start doing the rest of your stuff. Meaning that it's a little bit like when we talk about Nebula. It's a little bit like that, where it's like, you draw this late, it's probably not doing much. You can make it do a little bit more than Nebula, but not a lot more than Nebula. And it's just like gonna be kind of fine. I do think that I'm interested in exploring that. I wouldn't be shocked if it ended up just feeling a little bit too fair compared to the utterly unfair things that this game can give you access to at the moment. But I am interested in exploring it, especially in the context of also having a Clog sub-theme in the deck. Speaking of that deck I was just talking about, Miles Morales getting a buff to 4-6. I'm pretty excited for this. It was one of the buffs that I pitched in my video for cards that need to be revisited and improved. However, I kind of don't think they went far enough. I still think that 4-6 Miles pales in comparison to something like Mockingbird, especially in the context of Mysterio and the Hood and Cersei, allowing Mockingbird to be so much larger and genuinely freer. However, 4-6 does move this card closer to viability. I would have been happier with 4-7 or 4-6 and it costs 0, but they've been doing some stealth buffs to move your opponent's cards for a while now. Kingpin here, Stegron last patch, this card now. And so I am interested in trying the deck. Like, I can see a world where good enough stats and Clog type strategies with Kingpin, Polaris, Miles, Stegron ends up being a reasonably plausible way to try to win games of Marvel Snap. I'm not sure it's ever going to sort of overtake the Darkhawk method of doing that, but I can see it as a reasonable sub-theme in a deck like that. That makes some sense to me. It could end up becoming the dominant method of doing that. I doubt that it will because of Darkhawk's powerful hand disruption, but it could definitely make it into a deck like that. I especially want to point out Stegron Miles as like a legitimately powerful thing. That's a 4-7 and a 1-6. We're talking about what is effectively on par with Black Bolt's stature at this point, except you get a 4 cost doing it instead of a 5 cost. And I do think you could argue that Stegron's ability is on par with Black Bolt's in terms of disruption, especially if you have other Clog tools, because you can guarantee that you may clog a lane and then have this incredibly large 1-6 coming down the very next turn. For me, I feel like the breakpoint of where something becomes seriously busted playing it for 1 energy is about 6. So I'm not necessarily super opposed to that. Like, this is effectively the demon from the Hood, right? Like, it's a good thing to be doing. And I do think it's a worthwhile attempt at making Miles better that might work. And I think it's possible, right? I expect it to be possible, plausible, good. When I think about whether it'll be the best thing to be doing, my instinct is maybe not, but I am excited that it feels like it's very close to reasonable now after the buffs to Stegron, after this buff to Miles. And I think this sort of goes to show that most cards in Marvel Snap are really only a couple points of power away from being legitimate metagame considerations. Stegron Miles might end up as a rogue deck or it might end up as a real deck, but it is actually on par power-wise with a decent amount of the things people are trying. One thing I really want to keep in mind when it comes to Stegron is we talked about how Miles sort of pales in comparison to a card like Mockingbird, and that remains true. But something that's really good against Mockingbird decks, which very much key off of getting a lot of cards down that discount the Mockingbird, is clogging them. So there is some potential for a Stegron clog type deck that uses Stegron Miles well to have a good matchup into that, despite generally, I think, being a little bit of a weaker package than Mysterio Mockingbird. I have been pitching high Evo buffs for so long, so you might expect me to look at this and say, I'm so glad they did this. I am a little bit apprehensive. Now, I'm not going to say this is the wrong idea. It's the right idea. I think high Evo might be, and I know this is hyperbolic, the most important card for the health of this game. I think high Evo being good is the most important thing in bridging the biggest pain point in Marvel Snap. And that pain point is people who are leaving Series 2 and entering Series 3. If High Evolutionary is good, they are suddenly purchasing a new card that is effectively 7 new cards. That is immense. And those are 7 new cards that are roughly on par with some of the best in the game. Now, why are we in a situation where High Evo needs to get buffed? Well, I think the major reason is that we have seen some legitimate power creep at 2 of Evo's strongest slots. Evo's best cards, typically, have been High Evolutionary Cyclops and High Evolutionary Hulk. Those are 2 costs where we have seen massively powerful cards released in the most recent few months. When you compare Evolutionary Hulk to a card like Red Hulk, it becomes clear one of them is a little better than the other. Not a lot, but a little, right? And that little bit does matter. This was not true before Red Hulk released. When you compare Evolutionary Hulk to Magneto, you can very easily see that High Evolutionary Hulk might very well be better. There is a lot going for it. Even compared to something like Blob, the Blob requires a lot more specific deck building in order to get to the power levels that a couple skips can get High Evolutionary Hulk to. In Cyclops, I think the problem is even more pronounced. High Evolutionary Cyclops used to be basically the best possible 3-drop, like the strongest 3-drop there was. There just kind of wasn't a lot else, to be fair, but it was like incredibly, incredibly powerful. A 3-drop that scaled that way, basically getting double scaling off of Sunspot, immensely, immensely strong. In recent months, they have released a glut of extremely powerful 3-drops. Nocturne and Red Guardian, just to name a few. And that means that the effective value of having access to High Evo Cyclops and High Evo Hulk has dropped. The relative value of them compared to their peers has gone down. And those were the strongest High Evo cards. The other High Evo cards weren't incredibly important to a lot of High Evo decks. Misty Knight you run because it's easy to go with your Cyclops plan, it's easy to skip. Shocker didn't see a lot of play. The Thing doesn't see a lot of play. Abomination doesn't see a lot of play. The real power of High Evo traditionally has been the 3 and the 6, both of which were best in slot and now are not. And so when you look at why High Evo is in a situation where it needs a buff, I think you can see that this problem, that this buff to High Evo might not actually solve the real problem. The real problem is they're still a little bit worse than cards you don't have to pay a tax to run. And maybe that's the right thing for it to be. But I think if that's how we're going to approach it, then I have some further ideas to buff High Evo and make it more of a real threat than it previously was. Just a couple pitches, and you can do any of these, like just pick and choose a grab bag. I don't want to do all of them, obviously. I'm just going to throw a couple of them out there. Make it a 4/5, but with an ongoing ability that gives it +1 power for every evolved card you play. Make it a 4/7, just straight up. Be like, this is a good card that turns your other cards into decent cards. Give High Evo Hulk and High Evo Wasp and High Evo Thing their old abilities back. Wasp hit 2 things. This was problematic mostly with Lockjaw, and I don't think it's particularly problematic on its own, but maybe it is. Who knows? High Evo Thing used to throw 3 random -1s onto the board, and they changed it to be a little bit worse. Let's just be honest about that. And of course, High Evo Hulk did not used to was an ongoing ability, so it tracked passively that you were skipping turns and it didn't have to be in your hand. I think any number of those things plus what they did here could have made this a legitimate buff to High Evo in a way that I would be excited to play him. As is, I feel like this is the bare minimum buff to a card that I really want them to show love to. Because when you talk about the experience of playing Marvel Snap, when you get through Series 1, you get through Series 2, you're finally in the realm of real matchmaking. High Evo used to be the card that you could get and actually compete. And I don't think that's true anymore. And I'm not sure 4/6 makes it true either. And I want that to be true. I sincerely believe that having a deck, an easy-to-access, competitive, powerful deck, helps alleviate the worst part of the game, which is when you have 800 collection level and you are getting ruined by people like me. I want to queue into a High Evo deck and respect it. I don't think 4/6 makes that happen. I think 4/7 might. I think giving that power back to Wasp, that power back to Thing, that power back to the Hulk, that might too. I don't know. I'm interested to see how this goes, but my first instinct is I don't think they did enough for what I need this card to be. They might have gotten it up to some sort of close to bare minimum viability, but I need it to be actually good. I need it to be a deck I can put on the tier list and not be embarrassed about. And it hasn't been that in a while, and I think it is important to the health of the game that there be a card like that. High Evo is the closest thing we've had to it, and I really want us to get back to that if it's at all possible. Nick Fury is going to 4/6. I don't think that moves the needle on him at all. I'm actually genuinely kind of appalled that they even bothered here. This is the most nothing they've ever done in an OTA, I think. I've never looked at this and been like, oh, okay. That changes absolutely nothing. He's exactly the same card as he previously was. What that changes is Cersei rolled a 3-drop into a 4-drop and got Nick Fury, and he's 1 more point now. That's where this relevance is going to be coming from. Nick Fury needs to be significantly stronger than he is because he is currently programmed like his ability is an upside, but so very often what he's actually doing is that he is preventing you from drawing a card in exchange for you getting those 3 random cards. Because when you build a Nick Fury deck, you fill it with other cards that do things like what Nick Fury does. Put cards in your hand. And you do this, maybe you have a Quinjet, you're trying to build around the synergy of putting cards in your hand. Nick Fury puts too many cards in your hand. Straight up, he puts too many cards in your hand. That's just true. His RNG isn't controlled enough. There are a lot of really bad 6-drops in the game, and when you have this pool of genuinely quite bad stuff, and then you compare to, say, Valentina, who doesn't give you the problems of, oh, geez, my hand is now full. I just don't understand how you can look at this and say, yeah, this card needed 1 point of power. This card could be a 4/8, legitimately. He's costed like he's upside. He's almost never really the upside he wants because it's very unlikely a lot of the time that these random 6-drops are going to be better than a card you put in your deck because you put good cards in your deck. I mean, you don't because you're playing Nick Fury, but in theory you put good cards in your deck and not Nick Fury. I don't know. I don't get this. And Nick Fury, I think, is almost a card I would go back to the drawing board on because when you look at him, he's such a very straightforward design. But then when you play with him, there's so much oh, I'm not even drawing a card this turn, and I got Giganto, Null, and Blob. And I'm just sitting there looking at this oh, this sucks. This is terrible. I'm not doing anything. I'm not winning any games like this. And so maybe got it backwards, right? Maybe they're right, and it's doesn't matter how many points of power we put on him, he's going to suck anyway. but like at least put him to like 4-7 or 4-8 or something, man. I don't know, 4-6. Like compare this card to like Miles Morales or High Evo. What are we doing here? Alioth is gaining 2 points of power. I think this is a fairly significant buff. Like, when you look at the dominant 6 costs in the game right now, Alioth is already very close to being a very relevant one. And at 6-10, it's going to have a real body. It's going to really matter. There are not a lot of cards that get to 10 power. I realize it's kind of a reductive way of looking at it, but it's true. There just aren't a lot of cards that get to 10 power. And yes, it's 2 less power than the Hulk, and yes, Magneto is a 12 with a positive ability, but like, I was already kind of playing this card at 6-8, and at 6-10, it's just like, oh, that's actually very nice for me. So I think we're going to actually have a chance to stress test whether or not this card provides a healthy gameplay experience. To me, the nerf to this card has sort of allowed Second Dinner to skate on if it's actually fun for it to be everywhere for a while, because if this card is not fun to be everywhere, well, we haven't ever had a chance to figure that out because it hasn't been good enough for it to be everywhere. At 6-10, it might be good enough to be everywhere. I'm not saying it's the biggest deal in the world, but it is sort of pushing on a door that I'm not sure they want to open. It could happen, it could not happen. I get it. I could be wrong about this. But I do get the sense that people still don't like being fart clouded, and I'm not sure why you'd want to put the power back on something that people dislike so much. I'm hoping that people will allow this card to be accepted in sort of the new form that it has found itself in. But my experience with Leech is that even though Leech was a very different card from the Leech that everyone hated, everyone still hated it. And they treated it like it was the same card. And I guess I worry about the same thing happening with Alioth. I actually had a pretty decent amount of fun in the Leech meta because you could build like these ongoing type decks where Leech just never did anything to you. But I don't really know if that mattered to anyone other than me. And I do worry that Alioth has such a stigma attached to it in the Marvel Snap community that the second this card sees even a whiff of playability, a whiff of being around, a 10% play rate or something like that, that people might just get really, really mad. So on the one hand, I commend them for saying, we think this is the right balanced decision. We don't care if you get mad. On the other hand, I do worry people are going to get mad. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for sitting through that video. I actually am extremely grateful to anyone who made it this far in the video because, as you know, these were published early, and I actually wanted to talk about that a little bit because I am usually someone who is like, open-minded and tries to see all sides of an issue. So I'm just going to ask you to indulge me in a little bit of complaining from a fairly privileged perspective here, because I was really frustrated by the way Second Dinner responded to what was happening and publishing the notes a day early in response to some potential leaks. Now, I'm not here to sit here and defend people leaking stuff. That, whatever. I think it's bad. Of course. We signed NDAs. I get it. But the response to that being, we are going to publish these a day early. And I don't know if that's why it was responded in that way. I just know that I was in the general chat of the Marvel Snap Discord and people were talking about leaks. And then I was in my Discord and people were talking about leaks. And then I was suddenly seeing everything being confirmed in the front end of the Marvel Snap official server. And just personally, from the perspective of a content creator, I don't really know what better way to put it than to say that that screwed me. Stuff has leaked before, and they have responded by ignoring it. And that is helpful to me because I release a video every day, and I schedule a video every day. And so what that means is this video was already slated to go out tomorrow. It wasn't filmed or anything, but it's going out the day you're seeing it, right? And so now I was put in the position of either I make an emergency video, which, for the record, if I make an emergency video, it tanks your YouTube algo because I had just released the day's video. If you release 2 videos in a very short period, they conflict with each other. YouTube doesn't serve them as much, so that's bad for me. And then I would have had to find another video so I could keep doing 1 video a day that you'd be watching right now. Instead, I chose the other option, which is I'm covering it and I'm just going to talk about it, and we're going to just, we're going to go into it, and we're going to hope that maybe not everyone saw all the disclosures and all the stuff. But I guess I just wanted to say that it was really frustrating to deal with that. And so it feels like, to me, what I expect on this video is a video that people are typically very excited for, having the excitement taken out of it by the way they responded to what was happening. And I think that sucks. And I am sort of upset by it. I realize, privileged perspective. I get it. But it did make my job harder. And so for that reason, I'm very grateful to anyone who made it this far in the video, because I really appreciate it. Like, it means a lot that you are willing to, instead of me being a breaking news source, that I'm someone you want to stick to and watch the opinions of. And it means the world to me. So thank you so much. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.